and I'll say this to kind of side with you, okay?
Mm,
And the purpose of your whole project here with all of these episodes, the series I should say, of
mm,
episodes, is to show, I think, that I don't think, obviously, I'm sure you would agree that there are advantages, or maybe you could say we even need um, urban life in some ways.
mm,
But there's an imbalance, right? There's such a big divide, and
mm,
there's a lot. They just sometimes urban people or urban lifestyles, they don't understand or fully appreciate the other side, right? And maybe vice
mm.
versa. I think there needs to be more of a cohesiveness, a working together, and a teaching each other of different skills and ways of life. So I think there is an imbalance, and there's a lot less skilled public speakers than maybe back then. Back,
Mhm.
you know, when things were more rural.
Hello and welcome to Talk Academy, the podcast dedicated to improving ag literacy around the globe. My name is Brayden Black, and today we're talking about something that's near and dear to my heart, both agriculture and public speaking. And for many of you who've listened to the podcast for a long time, you know that I am a public speaker and that I enjoy the craft quite a bit, and that I've mentored others in the past in public speaking. That being said, I've noticed a distinct difference between public speaking in urban areas and rural areas, as well as a comfortability with public speaking and between people who live in those areas respectively. So here to talk about this topic with me today, I have an old voice that you guys should recognize well because he's been on a few episodes now. Brayden, why don't you go ahead and remind people who you are?
My name is Brayden. I am one half of the duo for Absolutely Gobsmacked. I was on an episode um, with you prior. It was quite a while ago, a few months ago, at least sometime last year, in regards to our episode on The Martian.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we talk about movies and on our podcast, so we mixed the two, and that was a lot of fun. Um, so I'm glad to be on and talk about something different. Something that I also enjoy and something that I have my own training on, um,
Mm.
in public speaking. And so, um, again, I'm not an ag. I don't know much about agriculture, especially not as much as Brandon here, but we'll see where that takes us. Okay.
All right, and just for the record, I know you're about to say ag nerd. It's okay. You can call me an ag nerd. I am.
How'd you know?
um, I hear you say ag. I'm not an ag person. I was like, I know you want to call me a nerd. Just do it. I fully accept it.
Ag geek. Geek is better.
All right. So yeah, Braden's been on the show before, and I've been on his show before.
Mm-hmm.
And we went over. Our episode was on Up, which is one of my favorite animated movies of all time.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic episode. You guys should go check it out, and I'll be sure to put all the links down in the description so you guys can go check it out. If you're a fan of movies, you're going to enjoy this podcast. It's definitely a lot of fun. I have listened to quite a few episodes. But yeah, so I think that without further ado, I was kind of not gonna lie, I was a little bit surprised that you reached out to me about the public speaking episode. That is not the one I was expecting you to want to be part of.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I've kind of been doing public speaking since I was like 10 years old.
Okay. Oh.
And then when I went to college, I took a few courses on that. Not to say that makes me an expert. There's always going to be someone better than you. But it's something that I have experience doing,
Mm-hmm.
and something I'm comfortable doing, and something I really, really enjoy, actually.
Awesome. Well, I can definitely relate to that. I mean, I was very shy for most of my life, and then I got most of my public speaking training in high school. And after receiving that training, I became a lot more confident and kind of became the person I am today. Actually, if it wasn't for my public speaking, I probably wouldn't have ever done the podcast. So it kind of helped me in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
now I kind of mentor other kids that were around that age, high school students, and some even younger, some older, in that in that realm. So I definitely have a strong affinity for public speaking. So I think we have a pretty equal ground here.
Yeah, I'd love to teach and help people that struggle with it. I mean, that's something that I think I would enjoy doing. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's awesome. That's a good idea.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I mean, it's made me a better speaker too
Mm-hmm.
because I've done, I've obviously got to practice it more, but I've also got to see what makes a good speaker and what doesn't. I've read books and done research on like public speaking strategies and like what made the great speakers and that sort of thing. And it's just it's true what they say. You don't fully understand something until until you can teach it to someone else. And if you teach someone something, it helps you remember it better.
Yeah, exactly. I think that goes with anything.
Hmm.
A little side note: 10 years old was I was kind of starting to branch out more and do more things that I probably wasn't comfortable doing. I started becoming a shy kid.
Mm.
Maybe when I started going to public school, um, especially when I moved, like in the middle of second grade, because I was like the class clown, and then I moved halfway through the year, and it just like it flipped a switch where I didn't know anyone, and I kind of kept myself, you know, enclosed and kind of shut down a little bit. And then at 10 years old, I just wanted to do something where I could express myself, all that pent up, emotion. So I actually did acting. Well, I did public speaking first and then went into acting. And that
Mm.
helps because there's a lot of similarities between public speaking and acting, but there's a
Mm.
lot of differences too.
Hmm.
Because
Interesting.
I've seen actors try to do public speaking and it's just it's not they can't, you know. Sometimes they just can't do it. It's just not the same thing. So to be able to tell the similarities and be aware of that and the differences, especially being able to be good at two different things that are similar but different, actually I think helps when it comes to both avenues.
Yes, I could definitely agree with that. And I definitely see my fair share of crossover as well. I haven't really done much of the acting thing, but I have seen public speakers that have tried to be a bit too much like actors, and I've seen
Mm-hmm.
actors try to be public speakers, and they have similarities. They have there's definitely applicable skills that work for both, but it's not always the best thing to cross over them in certain situations.
Mm-hmm.
Because you get some people that try to bring their acting into their speeches a bit too much, and then becomes a little bit too over dramatized, and not it doesn't get the point across quite well. And you have some public speakers who think that, oh yeah, I can speak, I can talk in front of people, and they lose all personality because they're a speaker, they're not an actor, and that
Right.
can take a lot of the magic out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, acting you're being someone else, but when you're a public speaker, you have to be yourself and you have to be comfortable being
Hmm.
yourself. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of goes into. Well, I'm glad that we kind of got some background there because that's actually really helpful for this conversation. Um, because I'm curious about a kind of a theory that I have, and I want to hear your thoughts on it. Because I've noticed in my experience that most of the best public speakers that I've known have come from somewhat rural backgrounds, and
Mm-hmm.
that there are quite a few public speakers that are very talented that come from urban backgrounds. It tends to be the type of environment you grow up in that tends to determine whether or not you're going to be a successful public speaker. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Basically, so obviously I grew up as a shy kid, and you mentioned that for a period of time you were shy as well.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I was shy, I grew up around a community that was very much not. I grew up
Right.
in a small town, but they were all very everybody knows everybody. Like nobody's afraid to speak their mind. They're all very vocal people. We just kind of sat around and talked about whatever in front of everybody. Like it was very much a casual environment, which made it a lot easier to speak in front of them because I knew them for one, and for two, we spoke about anything and everything in front of anybody and everybody. So it took away a lot of that nervousness that's often associated with speaking in front of people for the first time.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's a new perspective for me because honestly, the way I had always viewed it, and I'm not saying I disagree with you because actually I think your perspective is very very interesting and rings true in a lot of ways. Now
Mm-hmm.
that I realize, but my perspective was always one. You kind of have to have the talent for it. You kind of have to. Some of it's kind of just comes natural to you, in that some people are just really good natural speakers. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, it's not just that. It's the same thing with sports. You can be really talented, but if you don't practice and hone your skills and you only
Mm-hmm.
go so far. But to me it was like a good speaker is a mixture of talent and skill, and someone who's really really practiced and worked hard at their craft. If
Hmm.
that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely agree with that. I think that there are certain people who are just naturally or genetically or however you want to phrase it, they're automatically going to be better speakers than some others. Just off, right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
People will just naturally have, whether it be charisma or they just have an understanding of how speech is supposed to sound, or they just have a naturally loud and commanding voice, whatever
Mm-hmm.
it is. Some people just naturally have a knack for speaking. I think that the obstacle comes from either their comfortability with it or their ability to use it for the right reasons. Like I know people who are very, loud and charismatic and have the potential to be a great speaker. You put them on stage and they're a nervous wreck and they break down immediately.
Right.
So I think part of it is, yes, there's a natural ability there, and the other part of it is their comfortability with it, and that comes more from practice and from kind of understanding the structure of a speech and what goes into making a good speech. Because at least in my experience, if you know how to give a good speech, it makes giving the speech slightly less stressful rather than just trying to ad lib it while you're up there.
Okay, so here's something for you that
Mm-hmm.
I always it always kind of confused me, and I never really understood it myself. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I've said this many times to many people I'm close to. I'm more comfortable giving a speech or acting in a play, doing something on stage. Well, I wouldn't say something like singing, but something like
Mm-hmm.
that, than having a conversation with someone.
Interesting. Hmm.
And I've
That
never
that
fully understood why.
So I think that is interesting. So I'm definitely I can understand that. I definitely get where you're coming from. Because there are definitely times that I have enjoyed speeches much more than conversations because I think part of it is that you get to kind of control the flow. I think
Yeah.
that because in a speech you're the only one talking, right? So
Right.
you get to decide what gets said and what doesn't. In a conversation, you may have things you want to say, they get left out because the conversation changes. Um,
Hmm.
so that could be part of it, and not to say that you're that you're a control freak or anything, but like there's a
Right.
certain amount of control that's comfortable. Like I'm the same way. I like to be in control of what happens in a situation, but I don't want to control everything. Like I just like to be in a situation where the control is not taken from me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. Because I've always thought of it as I really enjoy, and I don't want to make this sound bad, but because giving a speech and acting has one huge similarity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it's that if you're good enough and you're convincing enough, you can manipulate people's emotions, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can make someone laugh, right? You can make someone cry,
Mm-hmm.
um, just by the words that you say, and maybe even facial expressions, gestures as well go into that. But it's like with the conversation, it's more unpredictable, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, you have less control um, over how the conversation is going to go. Where if you want, if you have an end goal as how you, like, it's like an argument, right? And you want to win an argument, for example, and you're trying to get to an end goal, but it's not going your way. That can
Right.
make me feel uncomfortable, right?
Yes. No, I absolutely get that. And with the speech, you always have the end in mind, right? Because you
Right.
wrote it, you know where it's going.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I definitely understand that. And I've definitely been in that situation where I've been like, like I've been talking to somebody like, I really expected this to go somewhere else, and I
Right.
kind of wish I could have gotten these points out.
Yeah.
So, um, but yeah, no, I think that there's a lot of validity in saying that speeches can be more comforting than conversations. I don't think the average person would agree with you,
Well, yeah.
um, because the average person is terrified of speaking. And that's actually a point that I wanted to kind of cover too. Public speaking is kind of commonly understood to be one of the most, if not the most, feared things in the entire world. Um, there's the common saying like people would rather be in the grave than giving the eulogy, kind of thing. Um, because people fear death more than speaking, just because
Right.
this is the thing I've been trying to figure out. Like, I get why speaking is terrifying, because I was scared of it for a really long time. But once I got comfortable with it, I loved it. It was super fun to do. And I learned how to control my nervous energy, because one of the things that I advocate for whenever I'm teaching somebody how to speak is that you don't have to get rid of your nervousness, because the nervousness never truly goes away, but you have to figure out how to use it to your advantage. And that's a big thing, that once they figure out how to do that, they get more comfortable with it. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. You might have a different opinion on how nervousness works, but
Oh no, actually, I completely agree with you. Um,
mm,
and that's the thing is like you can kind of compare that to a lot of things when it comes
mm-hmm,
to people being uncomfortable with something because they're just not used to doing it. And it's
right,
more, it's a little bit more than that. It's not that simple always, but when it comes to being nervous, I mean, the more you do something, I mean, in my eyes, you should always be a little bit nervous,
mm-hmm,
because if you're not nervous, it could mean that you're overconfident, and that's where you
right,
can easily make a mistake.
yes,
But the more you do things like giving a speech, the more you can control your nerves, as you mentioned, right? And kind of use it to your advantage, where it's almost like a motivation to do
mm-hmm,
to do well. You know what I mean?
yeah. No, absolutely, and that's one of my biggest things is, whenever I have a new speaker, and like when I was taking speech classes in college, I had this exact same thing happen. People would come up to me and say, "Hey, how are you so confident in speaking? I just get so nervous up there."
Yeah.
And I tell them, like, "Look, dude, I get nervous too. I'm just gonna
Mm-hmm.
tell you right now, I am not confident. If I come off as confident, that's because I'm doing a good job, but I'm not confident when I'm up there. It's
Right.
different." And when they kind of look at you sideways, then you go like, "Well, look, you're gonna have the nervous energy. Like, you're in front of, like, I usually like to break it down from a biological perspective. If you think about it, we're animals. Your
Mm-hmm.
audience is animals. We are a single animal in front of a bunch of animals. We're a prey. They are all predators. Our brain immediately goes into fight or flight and says, "Get out of there." Like,
Right.
that's why you want to. That's why you want to run away. That's why you want to break down. That's why your body gives you so much energy. You get so nervous and you're shaking so much because your body's trying to tell you to run. It's giving you all this energy to get off the stage. If you basically say, like, hey, like, your body's going to do it no matter what. Your body naturally does that for you. It never stops producing all the adrenaline or the energy, or, like, any of that kind of stuff. That's naturally going to happen, but you don't have to use it for what your body wants you to use it for. You can use it for whatever you want to use it for. So the adrenaline's going to be there, the nervous energy is going to be there, all of that's going to be there. You have the choice. Are you going to break down, or are you going to use it as passion? And that's the way you get around it. You convert all of your nervousness into passion, and your speech
Mm-hmm.
turns from pretty good to really good, as long as you can time the passion right.
Yeah, you gotta. There's a balance to
Right.
controlling that passion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that comes with experience too. I mean, you can um, you can get really nervous and and mentally tell yourself, I'm gonna channel that and turn it into passion, and then you can way overdo it, and it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
that backfired, right? So you do have to keep it under control a little bit, right? Um,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
but yeah, absolutely, I agree with you, 100%.
Yeah, and I think that that nervous energy is an important part of the conversation, because I think that that's kind of the driving factor behind so many people being afraid to become public speakers, or to even just practice it every now and then. But one thing I wanted to talk about, and this is something I'm curious about your opinion on.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of want to dive into a bit of the history of public speaking and kind of the fear of it, and like, because I think kind of what my theory is that around the time that agriculture and society started to drift apart, around the time the urban and the rural communities started to split, is around the time that public speaking became more and more of a higher priority fear.
Hmm. Okay. Um, okay. That's interesting. And why do you around and when exactly do you think that happened?
So I would say there have been trends throughout history where agriculture and society have become slightly split and then they come back together and they split again and come back together.
Okay.
I think that most recently though it happened around the early 20th century, around the Industrial Revolution, around the First and Second World Wars. That's kind of where I'm putting it, and I'll tell you why. So
Okay.
I'm not just saying it for the sake of, well, agriculture left, so obviously people aren't going to want to speak anymore because it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
There's a reason why I think this is happening, and I think that part of it has to do with agriculture, but not as much. Um, so this is kind of the part that's like, yes, it ties into my to my podcast, but this is also kind of just something that I just wanted poke at for a little bit.
Right.
Um, I think so. I'm going to kind of paint you a picture of the evolution of the Industrial Revolution, all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
So we started off in, let's just say it's 1900.
Hmm.
The Industrial Revolution is just beginning. We're getting out of the 19th century. The 1800s are ending. The Industrial Revolution is beginning. We're seeing new industries start to boom everywhere. Urban development is starting to grow for the first time. People are leaving the farms to go work new jobs in the cities, right? As that's happening, you're seeing rural communities shrink more and more. You're seeing urban communities grow more and more. But the thing is, they're working so much that they don't really have time for the community operations that they would normally have. They don't have as big of social circles. They don't go to church every Sunday and see their friends. They don't have breakfast with their neighbors anymore because they're working, so they just sleep and work and eat, and that's about it. Even relationships went through a change. This is where we started to see, kind of revolutions in the way that families started to operate. Um, During around the time of the Second World War, we saw such a boom of workers move from rural sectors to urban ones because they had a massive need for a workforce, and we have so many people going to war all of a sudden that we saw such a split between agriculture and urban development, and so many people went away from their traditional communities to just working nonstop. I think that was part of the first little split where public speaking started to kind of get neglected because it wasn't seen as a valuable skill, because you didn't see as many public speakers besides like presidents and some politicians and that sort of thing. As that era ended, we started to see the kind of the reinvention of modern society. The suburbs started to appear. Agricultural sectors got pushed even further off into the back burner. And those rural communities that used to spend time just sitting around talking, having fun, playing games or whatever, that became so uncommon because urban jobs were way more desirable, and because so many people had already been working then, they just went straight back to them, that you started to see this evolution of a new type of society that was less driven on large communities and more driven on individual families. And as they became more individual and families, they had less of a need for speaking in front of large crowds, and that discouraged them from practicing their public speaking skills. So we've progressed a little bit more. We go through like the 60s and 70s, and that kind of stuff just continues to evolve. There's not much different in there. The only thing is maybe during the Vietnam War, there was a bit more incentive for people to speak out just because there was a lot of protests at that time. And the civil rights movement, I would say, is also part of that, because you had Martin Luther King, obviously one of the greatest speakers of the last couple centuries. So that little bridge of history is a little bit weird, because you had some speakers, but most people were kind of just following what was going on with the rest of the crowd. There wasn't quite as much incentive to really practice speaking as much as there used to be. As we got into like the 1990s, I mean, you started to see a bit more of a shift, because now screens are becoming a thing. Mm-hmm. Computers were starting to come out. The earliest phones were coming out in the early 2000s that had screens and were fully operational for more than just texting or calling. As that technology began to advance, and especially as social media began to develop, we had less and less people interacting face to face in smaller and smaller groups, and that even more de-incentivized the idea that we needed to be speaking in front of large crowds anymore. And so I think that, again, it's not that agriculture, the split from agriculture caused this, but I think that the two happened simultaneously. Yeah. As the split from rural communities began, the fear of public speaking increased because the practice of it was greatly decreased in demand.
Yeah, I can definitely see, the more recent trend where screens have limited the ability to have a normal conversation, much less be able to give a speech. But I never actually thought about tying it all the way back to the Industrial Revolution.
Mhm.
But I mean, the way you explain it makes so much sense. Um, for example, you talked about the family unit and
Yeah.
not having a need to give speeches to the community in general, right?
Mhm.
Less and less people going to things like church, where that's where a lot of speeches are given or a lot of socializing happens, right?
Right.
Where people are comfortable, yeah, talking to their family members, right? You live with them.
Mhm.
But as far as, you don't talk to your family member, or you don't talk to people outside your family the same way you talk to your family members, right?
Right.
So we're talking about different ways of speaking and not having that socialization, that specific socialization. And so you're saying that basically socializing with others ties has a lot to do with the ability to give public speeches, right?
Yes, I would say that's a big part of it.
Okay, and I mean that makes sense. Just never thought of it that way. I never really delved deep into that idea, but
Mhm.
that's very interesting.
Yeah, and I don't bring it up for no reason. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think I the reason I bring it up is not just because I think it's, oh yeah, that's interesting. The urban rural split happened around the same time the public speaking split happened.
Right,
Like that's
right.
not like there is a reason I bring it up. Particularly around this mini series that I'm doing on this theory. Um, I have this firm theory, and this is the part where it ties back into the podcast, but it also kind of the grounds for this, the logic for this becomes a bit more unstable. So this is the part where if you're going to call me out on something, this is the thing I think you can call me out on
Okay,
because
I'll do it.
it's a bit out there. But I think that let's see, how do I want to phrase this? So basically, I learned how to speak through my high school youth leadership group FFA. I'm sure you've
Okay.
heard of FFA
Yeah.
before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was my first experience with public speaking, and I learned how to speak by giving speeches about issues regarding agriculture. That's actually my earliest inspiration for the podcast. Was I was giving speeches on agricultural issues so often, I started to notice one of the most common issues across all of them was people don't know where their food comes from. So I started a podcast about that. As I explored this idea, that there's this youth leadership organization dedicated to teaching kids leadership skills and agriculture, and leadership skills based in agriculture, I started to think, well, why are those two things connected? That's a very oddly specific thing to have connected. And I've been kind of exploring this idea for a little while now, that agriculture serves as kind of a foundation of society. Um, it's actually, that's the next part of the mini series is supposed to come out after this one, and the other part about social media is that the agriculture is the foundation of society, and it's tied into everything from our art to our music to our movies to our books, everything. I mean, we did a whole episode on The Martian about that.
Right.
um, this idea that agriculture is tied to the roots of society has also led me to believe that as society grows away from agriculture, as it begins to take agriculture out of the equation, it becomes more unstable. And as such, people are less inclined to operate as they normally would in the society. And I think that public speaking is considered one of those normal operations. People are less comfortable opening up about things and speaking about them publicly to a crowd, and I think that part of the reason that's happening is because of that separation from the foundation of society. It's becoming more and more unstable because we're just focusing so much on, again, the screens, the social media, the less interaction from face to face and more interaction with, somebody online that we don't know. And again, that's the part of the theory that I can see a lot of potential logic holes in, but that's kind of where I'm going with this.
Well, here's my thing. I think your perspective or your opinion on that applies in a lot of situations. Um, you say holes. I wouldn't say holes. I just think it wouldn't apply to every situation, if that makes
Okay.
sense. I wouldn't say that there's holes in the logic. I would say that logic does apply in many instances. That's my opinion.
Okay.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think a lot of people would agree. Those who are raised in more rural areas gain more life skills and gain them earlier in life,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
work ethic and manners, and a lot of things that people lack these days because they rely on other people. They
Mm.
have things easier, right?
Mm.
So I think it applies to a lot of things, including public speech, which I think your whole project kind of the point is to show the big difference, right?
Right.
And so I definitely think you're onto something, and I definitely think your logic in this case, when it comes to public speaking, does apply to in a lot of ways to most people. So I would agree with
Mm.
that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I'm not completely crazy.
I understand your viewpoint. I think like with almost everything, there are some what's the word, some exceptions,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, definitely.
And I would say maybe I'm an exception. I was not raised necessarily in a rural. I was raised in a stable household where I had to, learn certain things for life. So I had definitely an advantage over other people that were raised in some urban households. So I think that does contribute a little bit to my ability or my enjoyment in public speaking.
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, some people are just born, like I mentioned, some people are just born with ability, you know, um,
Right.
and then they realize that and they work at it, and
Yeah.
they could be computer nerds, right? The
Right.
opposite of an ag nerd,
Right.
and they just
I
happen to
mean,
be good at public speaking.
there actually are some ag computer nerds, believe it or not.
Wow, yeah, like you.
Yeah, that'd be one. Yep. No, I think that you got a solid point though, and that is something that while I was thinking up this theory, that's something that kind of kept poking at me is that not every good public speaker comes from a rural background,
Right, right.
and that's definitely one of the that's like kind of like the logical inconsistencies that I was kind of referring to. Because I was thinking about it and I was like, well, a lot of the great presidents that were, fantastic speakers were farmers, but most of the early presidents were farmers because most early people were farmers. So that wasn't exactly a good logical claim to make. And I was trying to think through other ways I could make that work, but I think it's best suited by saying, kind of like you said, it's applicable in most situations, but obviously there's going to be a lot of people who learn how to speak through other means and became proficient at it, and they didn't come from a rural background.
Yeah, I think what, and I'll say this to kind of side with you, okay?
Mm.
And the purpose of your whole project here with all of these episodes, the series I should say, of
Mm.
episodes, is to show, I think, that I don't think, obviously I'm sure you would agree that there are advantages, or maybe you could say we even need urban life in some ways.
Mm.
But there's an imbalance, right? There's such a big divide, and
Mm.
there's a lot. They just sometimes urban people or urban lifestyles, they don't understand or fully appreciate the other side, right? And maybe vice
Mm.
versa. I think there needs to be more of a cohesiveness, a working together, and a teaching each other of different skills and ways of life. So I think there is an imbalance, and there's a lot less skilled public speakers than maybe back then. Back,
Mhm.
when things were more rural, right?
Yeah. No, I would definitely agree with that. And I would say that, to your point, I think it's often kind of seen that I defend the agricultural point of view, but I'm definitely taking the position as the bridge between both,
Right.
that you can't have one without the other. Agriculture needs urban development and technological advancement to thrive, and obviously urban development needs agriculture because food.
Mm-hmm.
And separating one from the other is just going to cause the other one to struggle. Um, so the big thing that I'm shooting for, and also like to your point, there are plenty of people in rural areas that struggle with public speaking as well. It's
Mm-hmm.
definitely not an exclusive issue to urban development. It's more so as a society we have gotten weaker in our speaking development, and part of that you could say is because even like the rural areas have had to adapt to urban advances and that sort of thing. But really, I think it's just because we haven't practiced it nearly as much. Public speaking hasn't really been a priority in schools or hasn't really been taught to a lot of kids. And so it's kind of losing its luster when really it should be practiced more. But the main point that I think that I'm trying to get across most is that we can't have urban without rural, we can't have rural without urban, and these are some of the negative side effects that we're seeing from them being so disconnected, public speaking being one of them.
Yeah, I'll tell you about my experience in college. One semester, I think I only needed like one or two classes
Mm-hmm.
before I started the next semester, which was I was kind of all full go, a book schedule, right? So I had a semester where I just needed one or two classes, so I had the freedom or the ability to take a couple extra classes to keep me busy, and I took two different speech classes. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
one was more of fundamentals and the basics, right? And the other one was just full blown public speaking. Um, but I learned that it almost felt like, to your point, um, it just felt like we spent so much time teaching people basics that I felt like I already knew.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that took up most of the semester,
Mm-hmm.
and it didn't sit right with me. I felt like the expectations as a whole are a little too low when it comes to public speaking. And not everyone's a good public speaker, and some people are required to take the class for whatever they're doing. But I think that if you're required to take that class and do well in it, you're going to need it for whatever career you're going for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just felt like the expectations as far as public speaking were a little low, in my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
um, because as a whole, people are very weak in that aspect of life. And you had people of all different sorts of personalities. I mean, you had outgoing people, you had shy people,
Mm-hmm.
and they all had different strengths and weaknesses. But as a whole, it's kind of disappointing to see it, honestly. And I'm not trying to make myself sound like I'm this amazing advanced, speaker or anything like that. It just made me think, you know, um, about like, hey, I think this class would be much more difficult or have much higher expectations even a few decades ago, you know?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And I actually had a similar experience. I think it was my second or third semester of college. I took a public speaking class similar to you. It was supposed to be like kind of like an intro to public speaking class, but it was like grounded in business, like a business
Mm-hmm.
public speaking class.
Right.
Um, and I found myself a little bit like, kind of underwhelmed, by how
Right.
simple the class was.
That's a good
And
word to describe it.
yeah, and like there were people getting up there and speaking, and they were doing fine. But I was like, really, like this is a required class. Like I really didn't think this was something that needed to be taught. And my teacher was actually really impressed with my speaking ability, and I used to
Mm-hmm.
like kind of sit in his office after class sometimes and just talk to him about speaking styles and stuff. And he would talk to me about how like, yeah, the class, it needs to be really simple because you have some people who come in here like you that are very good speakers and they just kind of blow through the class like it's nothing, but you have a lot of people who come in that they may do fine with the material, but if you crank the difficulty up even a notch, they completely fall under
Yeah.
all the nervousness.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a shock to me. I guess I greatly underestimated how anxious people can get with just a little bit more pressure on them. Um, and he said that the reason that he appreciated having people who were skilled in speaking in the class is because he was hoping that others would see them. Like he was like, I know that the class is easy for you. I'm not going to make it any harder for you.
Yeah.
I want others to see you as a good speaker and take example off of your style. And he used to do that all the time. I would give a good speech, and he would say, "Hey, you see how he did this, this, and this? This is really good, and here's ways I think he can improve." The only time I ever did bad on any of my speeches is just because I went over time, but that's just because I talk a lot.
Yeah.
Um,
I
but
know. No, I'm
I,
kidding.
but I always gave like good structured speeches that
Right.
sounded good, and I used vocal inflect, all that kind of stuff. I was very methodical in my speeches, and I actually mentored a couple of the kids in that class. I helped them pass that class, and I didn't realize until I was talking to them just how much they struggle with some of those
Yeah.
basics. And when I saw that, I was like, wow, like even when I was still a shy kid, like this is stuff that I understood. You know, it wasn't stuff that was just like foreign to me as a subject. Like it was, you know, it wasn't that out of my range of expectation for what a speech should sound like. And for them, it's just like it's another language.
Yeah, but here's the thing, Brendan, and I want your opinion on this. And I came to that realization that,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a really good point that you brought up, that if you made it even if they made it a little bit difficult, the vast majority of people would struggle in the class,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, so it would be unfair for me to expect, everyone to be at my level. That would be really cocky, and that would be unfair because it could be the other way around, and something that I'm not very good at, and I wouldn't appreciate that if I were in the other situation, right?
Right.
But here's the thing that I realized, or that I learned about myself, is when I realized someone would go up there and give a fine speech, right? Like you said, they would do fine, and
Mm-hmm.
it was like an AA plus. As a younger Brayden, more inexperienced Brayden, what I would do was just wing it.
Mm-hmm.
I would just improvise the speech.
Right.
She would give me the topic, and I just go up there, and I would get an A. And I'm not, and honestly, I definitely could have done better if I had an actual outline. I mean, you know that, right?
Oh yeah.
But I did good enough. But I didn't reach my full potential in that class
Mm-hmm.
because I felt like I didn't have to exert myself fully.
Yeah. No, I've definitely I felt that as well. Yeah, I've had speeches in the past that were like very very simple speech topics that were just
Mm-hmm.
for like an assignment, or like even if it wasn't for a speech class, like if we had to give a presentation in class and it wasn't a very hard presentation, I found myself putting less effort into those presentations just because I was like, oh, it's easy, they're not going to be expecting me to actually do well at this, which granted probably isn't the best attitude to have. You should put effort into every presentation you do so that way people see you as a good speaker. But like I get what you mean. There's a certain level of like, well, if they're gonna expect the lowest level of quality possible, then I'm gonna give them what they expect, kind of thing. Like there's no reason in putting more effort into something that's not gonna get any more value out of it.
And I don't think that's a good way to do things. I don't think that's a good thinking. Obviously,
Right.
if I would go back, I would still give 110% because, you know, um, it does take you places. It can take you places. She ended up, the professor ended up
Mm-hmm.
choosing three students from her classes to give um, speeches. I think it was on a Saturday, um, on topics that were relevant. It was like a competition thing that the
Mm.
college had. And it's like, man, if I had given my 110%, I would have liked to do that, right?
Yeah.
So, that can definitely backfire on you. Um,
Yeah.
but I'll give you an example of what happened. It's kind of a funny story. We had to do a group project. It was four of us. And we had
Mm-hmm.
to do a slideshow presentation, and it was on relationships, right? So everyone had to do something about relationships. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be romantic, whether it be platonic, family, whatever, right?
Right.
And ours was basically on male and female relationships of the opposite sex,
Mm.
and um, so I had what happened with the group project was we each had to do like a certain had like a certain slot. Like say it's a 20-minute presentation, and each of us had like 5 minutes, right? Um, they put the slideshow together. They sent it to me. It was because it was two guys and two girls, right? The two girls did the slideshow, made it all pretty looking, everything like that, right? Made it look really nice, I should say. And
Mm-hmm.
then they sent it, and I didn't even look at it. I didn't look at it at all. I didn't read what it was about. I just had
No.
a general idea. The day we have to present comes, and I wing it. Literally, they put the slide up on the screen. I'd never seen it. I look at it, and then I just give like a little spiel on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had people just going like it was basically like how a guy should treat a girl. That's how I remember it. Okay.
Gotcha.
So I was going off on, and everyone's like, "Yeah, yeah, hey, he's right." And then, you know, I ended up helping the get a better grade overall as a group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but looking back, it's like, man, I wish I had put more effort into it.
Yeah.
So that's just that was why I kind of brought that up, is because I was just, I think, because to tie it all together, because of the divide, right? Because of
Mhm.
the lack of the skills needed to give a public speech. Because of that, I feel like the standards are much lower too.
Yeah. No, I can definitely agree with that. I think that's a good way of looking at it. Is we have kind of so a good example of this. I've been asked before because I like studying speakers. I like kind of listening to public speakers and kind of taking apart their speeches, seeing what was good about it, what
Right.
I would change, that kind of stuff. I've been asked before if I think that there's any like really good public speakers alive today. And I thought about it, and like there's some that I would definitely say are good speakers, just objectively. They know how a good speech should sound. But I was thinking about it compared to like throughout history,
Yeah.
and there's not nearly as many good speakers today as what there used to be. And I think it's because of exactly what you just said. We've lowered our standards for what we consider a good speaker, and because of that, speech quality has gone down overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And people can give a good speech, and it may be a good speech, but it's not going to tear your heart out, and it's not going to make you feel anything super impactful. And that's like we talked about at the beginning of this episode. That's what I would that's why I would categorize as a good speech, something that makes me feel a particular way, or really encourages me to want to do something, or that sort of thing. And listening to the speech, the speakers that we have available today, there's not a whole lot that I hear their speeches and I'm like, yeah, like I really feel like, there's some that have made me feel like that, but for the most part, I'm kind of just like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
that was a good speech. I forget about it.
Yeah. You know what? I've thought about that too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you think about if you were to study in a speech class nowadays, how many more recent speeches or speakers would you study compared to speakers of the past? I
Not a
mean,
lot.
right. And you think of like you know popular speeches, right? Gettysburg
Mm-hmm.
Address,
Oh
John F.
yeah.
Kennedy, even his brother, right? Martin
Mm-hmm.
Luther King Jr. I Dream a Dream. There's
Oh
not
yeah.
speeches like that anymore, right?
No.
They still use phrases from their speeches even to this day, and there's nothing new. There's nothing new, um,
Right.
and I've noticed that too. Even like someone like, and I hate to say it, but like Hitler was known as a very good motivational
He was a
speaker.
very, yeah, he's a very charismatic speaker.
Right. And we shouldn't have to use his example. We should have more examples than that, you know.
Right. It
And
seems like, sorry, I don't mean to cut you
no, go
off.
ahead.
Um, you made a really solid point there that I want to highlight. You said that we still use pieces of other people's speeches today,
Right.
and that there's not a whole lot of originality in speeches.
Mhm.
It seems to me, and this is something that I've even noticed in movies, and I'm sure you've explored it quite a bit. That even like movies today are often recreations of other movies. There seems to be less originality in more modern movies than the original stories and that sort of thing.
Right.
I think that's happening with speeches. I think that people are almost becoming lazy, and they're like, well, this was a good speech. I'm just going to repeat what he said instead of
Mhm.
coming up with genuine. Because, like, how many speeches within the past probably 10 years have names? Like the Gettysburg Address, or
Mhm.
"I Have a Dream," or George Washington's, address, the Proclamation after the war, or
Mhm.
the Proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation. Like how many speeches actually have names nowadays? Like
Can't think
we
of anything.
remember, right? Like we remember some speeches as like, oh yeah, that was kind of a good speech, but we barely remember what was said. We like what we're hearing when we're hearing it, but I haven't heard a speech in my lifetime that I was like, yeah, that's going to be remembered for history. Like it's just not happening anymore.
What's the most recent famous speech you can think of?
I mean, there was I would say probably the speech that George Bush made on 9/11.
Okay. That's fair.
That's the most recent. Now, I was only 1 year. I was only a year old when that happened. So like that was 20 years ago. I really can't think of like, in recent years, like, you know, I don't think we've had a president since George Bush that's made a speech that I've remembered. That that I could easily cite as like that was a good speech kind of speech. Like there's some that are like, oh yeah, that was he made some good points, but like
Right.
there was nothing that was like, man, that speech is gonna be remembered.
Yeah, and I remember George Bush was a pretty decent speaker. I know he was actually. I think he's more popular for some of the phrases he uses and people making fun of them. Really,
Yeah.
because he had an interesting way of speaking or expressing himself. But
Right.
honestly, like even the 9/11 speech, to me at least, is a little more forgettable. Um,
Hmm. I could agree with that. I'd say like probably Reagan is probably one of the more
yeah,
recent.
I was gonna say the most recent speech that sticks with me was actually when Reagan addressed the nation after the Challenger explosion.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
To me, that's like the most recent speech that really sticks with me.
Yeah, I could agree with that actually. Like I would say if you were to ask an American, they would probably say the 9/11 thing. But if you were to ask just like a public somebody who studies public speaking, I would say that's probably their answer is pretty much any of Reagan's speeches,
Yeah.
honestly.
Well, he was an actor, so
Right? Yeah, he was one of the few that could do both and pull it off
yeah.
well.
So yeah. Um, but that is
Interesting.
interesting, and I've thought about it before.
Hmm.
But I always thought like, well, maybe I just don't pay attention as much as to current events that I do to historical events. But now that you're agreeing with me, it's kind of eye opening.
No, trust me. I've like because like I said, I like studying speeches. There's a couple of speakers today that I really enjoy listening to their speeches, but I wouldn't consider them historical speeches.
Right.
They're not like phenomenal that I would say I would remember. Like the only reason I remember their speeches is because I listened to them a few times just to kind of pick
Right.
them apart. But
Yeah.
like I've listened to presidential speeches, between like Trump, Obama, and even George Bush. I've listened to all their speeches, and none of them have really wowed me. I haven't heard any like major politicians make any good speeches that have really wowed me. Like there hasn't been anything that I was like, yeah, that's going to be remembered.
Okay. So I'm just curious. Um, political or not, who do you think
Mhm.
are the best speakers alive right now? Maybe even just a handful. I don't know how many you could think of.
I would say so. So one of the speakers I often point to I consider him a good speaker, but not a traditionally good speaker. So he doesn't exactly follow the rules of a good speaker, but his speeches are very compelling and good. They're easy to listen to, and he has a very particular style of speaking that I think is attractive to a lot of people, and that's Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
So that's one of my big ones. Um, are we talking just people who are alive today, or like how?
Well, yeah, I was thinking alive today that would still be giving speeches today.
Okay. Because I would say another one I listen to quite a bit is I can't remember his first name. Chris Voss.
Okay.
So he's a big one I listen to quite a bit. Admiral, I can't remember his first name. Admiral something McRaven. Um, you might have heard his Make Your Bed speech. What is his first name? I can't remember. But anyway, Admiral McRaven, he's phenomenal. I've listened to his speeches. He's written 2 books now. I've read one of his books. He's really good. Other than
Yeah.
that, I really can't think of a lot.
I mean, I don't know if you agree with me, but I think the vast majority of speeches nowadays are lean extremely on the motivational side of things.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Whereas I'm not a, I mean, obviously they have their place and they are important, and especially a
Hmm.
lot of, but I'm not a, that's I'm not. Those are not my favorite speeches personally. I
Yeah.
prefer more of the uh, touching speeches, I guess, is what you would
Hmm.
say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I will say, so I agree with you. I'm not a big fan of motivational speakers or motivational speeches, just because I think they get a little bit too,
Mm-hmm.
like they try a little bit too hard.
Right.
Like they're trying to be motivational, so it just comes across as kind of sappy.
Right.
Um, but there is one speaker that I actually heard at one of my FFA conferences that to this day I still consider a phenomenal speaker. I don't know if you ever heard of him. I'm trying to remember what his name is off the top of my head. It's Rick Rigsby. That's what it is.
Okay. I haven't heard of any of the guys you've named so far. So
Really?
yeah.
So yeah, Rick Rigsby. He did a speech. He was actually on Goalcast, which is a YouTube channel that public speakers, and a lot of them are motivational types
Yeah.
speakers. But his is actually a really, really touching story that he does, because all of their speeches aren't just like, "Hey, go out there and do great things, guys." It's like, "Hey, I've gone through hell and back. You should,
Yeah.
you should be fine." Um, so his speech is really good. I've actually heard him speak twice in person, and then I've listened to his video a few times. He's phenomenal. Um, if you're looking for more of like a not inspirational, informative speaker, Temple Grandin is one of my favorites, but she's more like she's an advocate for autism because she's an autistic lady, and
Mhm.
she speaks on behalf of the animal agriculture industry quite a bit. She's designed a lot of the slaughterhouses in the United States, and she's phenomenal.
Me personally, I think informational speeches are the most difficult to pull off.
They are. I agree. And if you can pull off a good one, then I
Yeah.
tip my hat to you.
Yeah. That's what I struggle with the most.
Yeah.
Is because I want to make it interesting, right? I mean, everyone does. You want to capture someone's attention, but you also want to be
Right.
factual and make sense and be able to explain everything well too.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. What about just in general, not alive? Who are some of the greatest speakers do you think of all time?
Oh man. So I just got done reading a book called "Stand Like Lincoln, Speak Like Churchill,"
Yep.
and I don't know if you read that one.
No, I haven't.
Okay, I would recommend it. It's a phenomenal book. It goes over a lot of like the body language tricks that Churchill used to use, and it goes over a lot of like the speech, or sorry, the Lincoln used to use, and a lot of the speech tricks that Churchill used to use. Um, and that made me really appreciate Churchill's speaking style. So I've always admired Abraham Lincoln, his speeches and his body language, because he was very he was kind of like a country hick, like he kind of just had like a really thick
Yeah.
Southern accent that a lot of people had a hard time understanding. So he wasn't the best speaker, but he was really, really good at getting people to trust him, because he was very compassionate with his body language. And he, like, I'm a big body language person when it comes to
Yeah.
public speaking. And so he was like a huge inspiration for a lot of my body language when I speak. So he's really, really, I love Lincoln. Churchill's a big one. I actually really, really love Martin Luther King Jr. Like I've listened to his speeches quite a few times, and I've done a lot of research on his speaking style, and he was really, really cool. Um, Other than that, though, those are kind of my big three.
Mm-hmm.
There's really not anyone else that I would say I listen to a lot. Like there's kind of just people. I mean, Reagan's obviously, like, Reagan's at the top of everybody's speaking list, so like Reagan's up there for me too. But I kind of like don't even count him anymore, because he's just like, everyone knows he's such a good speaker.
Yeah.
Um, so he's kind of like, he's like number one above number one, and then it's Churchill, Lincoln, Martin Luther King.
Interesting. Okay.
So what
I personally like maybe it's just his accent, but JFK, I don't know, it kind of
okay, I
draws
could see
me.
that. See, I really love JFK, the JFK Nixon debate,
Yeah.
the famous, the first ever televised presidential debate.
Mhm.
I cite that in so many speeches. Because I do a lot of so I play around in VR quite a bit, and I've done VR speeches for like conferences and
Oh
stuff.
wow.
I've been a keynote speaker in a couple of different meetings and conferences, and we've gotten like a decent amount of people, like 30 or 40 people for each speech, which is pretty good. And I gave a speech one time on the value, because I used to teach a public speaking class in VR, and I gave a speech one time on the value of learning how to speak in VR versus in reality, because it kind of alleviates some of that nervous energy right off the bat, so you can learn the basics of speech, and then you can practice that in real life, and that's how you kind of master the nervous control.
Huh.
It was a theory I was working on. I never got a whole lot of evidence, but it seemed like it was working for my students at least. But I gave a speech about how, the future of speeches and presidential debates and all this kind of stuff could very well be in VR. Like, we don't know, just because of how fast the technology is advancing.
Right.
And I used that Nixon JFK debate as an example. I was like, look, guys, Nixon and JFK had the first ever presidential debate on television. The anyone who listened to the debate on the radio says that Nixon won by a landslide. Anyone who watched TV said JFK won by a landslide. There's a very particular reason why. and I explained to them, the importance of body language and vocal inflection and all this kind of stuff. Like I cite that debate more often than anybody else I've ever heard talk about that debate, and I think I'm a little bit crazy, but I think it's a really useful thing for teaching people how to speak.
Interesting. I never explored that before.
Mm-hmm.
You have to show me.
I can show you what I'm talking about. But
yeah. I had
who else is on your list?
Oh man, who else is on my list? Ooh.
JFK's your number one.
Yeah, I like Robert Kennedy too.
Okay.
I like the accent. I hate to keep bringing him up, but I did study Hitler at one point a while ago.
He's got an interesting speaking style, I will say.
I didn't understand what he was saying, obviously. So I looked into like subtitles or transcripts of the speech, and it was just interesting how he basically like could manipulate people's feelings and emotions so well. That's how he was able to get such a huge following on his own. It's just crazy to me.
Right.
I hate to give him credit, but
No, I mean, like, there's a certain level of like you can objectively say that somebody was impactful in a particular way.
They were good at what they did, good or bad.
Right.
So, but what do you think are like if you had to do like a top 5 most important? How do you say it? Maybe qualities or aspects of a good speech or a good speaker. What would they be?
Question. This would have been great. So I used to run a public speaking podcast that I stopped doing. This would have been great for that, but oh well. Yeah, no, that's really tough. I would say, I'm not sure. So I'm just going to kind of list them off, and then I'm going to try to put them in order. I would say that first of all, so volume is a big thing, obviously.
Yep.
People need to hear you, but you can't be yelling at them. There's got to be a good regulation of volume. I would say that personality needs to be a big part of it. Like you don't want it to be dry, but you don't want to be over the top either. You have to be. I'm not gonna say personality. I'm gonna say authenticity. When I hear a good speech, I want it to be coming from that person's heart. I want it to feel like that person wrote those words and means them with everything they say. That's actually, I think, one of the reasons I don't like modern speeches as much is because a lot of speeches are written by not the speaker. And like, somebody's, especially like presidents, a lot of presidents give speeches that they didn't write, which I know that, that's been going on for years now. Even Churchill gave speeches that he didn't write. But a lot of the best speeches are speeches that come genuinely from that speaker's, that's genuinely what they believe. And that makes a huge difference. Like, if you're giving a speech and you don't believe what you're saying, then nobody's going to take you seriously.
Yep.
So I would say that that's a big one too. So volume, authenticity, passion's obviously a big part of that. But I think passion kind of ties into the authenticity.
Yeah.
Like if you mean what you say, you will be passionate. So I'm not sure if I want to include that one or not. Body language is a huge thing for me. Like I would honestly probably put body language at the top of that. Like above anything else. If you have good body language, that makes a speech. I mean, quite clearly, that's how JFK won, the election, because he had better body language than Nixon did. And then I would say, let's see. I mean, I think that, a lot of people tend to think that a good speech comes from an extensive vocabulary or being an incredibly smart person. It doesn't at all. People give, like Abraham Lincoln gave incredibly simplistic speeches, very, very short speeches. Like he was notorious for short speeches, and he had a bigger impact than most other speakers of his time, and actually most other presidents in general.
Yeah, that is a common misconception, but you have to understand the simpler the better, because you'll be able to connect with more people. You know what I mean?
Right.
Not everyone can. If you have a huge vocabulary, not everyone will be able to follow or understand what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. So like, and I'm a big person that's like, I have an extensive vocabulary, but I don't like using it because I don't want people to not understand me. Whatever. But like, whenever, like one of my biggest pet peeves with the whole, is actually part of the podcast, the whole issue I have with the ag industry is that we use all this language that people who don't work in the industry don't understand, and then we wonder why they get mad at us for not knowing how things are operating. We don't translate it to them. Like I'm a big person. I'm a big believer in the idea that if you are going to tell somebody something, you better tell it to them in a way that they're going to understand. Like, don't dumb it down, but make it layman's terms.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I would say my top 5 would be body language, passion slash authenticity, um, you know, like language choice, simplification. That's a good word for it. Volume, and then probably the last one would just be kind of just knowing your stuff. Like if somebody goes, like you don't have to be a genius, but like if you're giving a speech and like you're forgetting stuff halfway through, or like you're saying incorrect stats, or you're like you're speaking about things that are not very true, and you don't sound very confident about the fact about the things you're saying, it just comes across really bad. Like I want people to be confident in what they say, and for it to be true. Like mostly like true is a tough word, because like a lot of speeches that aren't informative. Like they can't all be like true. It's it's their version of true, but like know what you're talking about, basically. Go in there with the confidence of what I'm saying is true, you better believe it. I would say that's kind of my 5th point. That one might be above volume, actually. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you have your own list. But
well, I'll throw out a top 5 in no particular order, but okay. I like to preface it by saying there's definitely more than 5. I'm sure you'll agree.
Oh yeah,
there's
absolutely.
Gotta be more. There's got to be more than because if you just have these 5, probably won't make a good speech, right? But it'll help, obviously. I think a big one that maybe you didn't mention, which I know you'll find important, is eye contact.
Oh yes.
Being able to and you have to have a good eye contact, not just eye contact. You don't want to stare someone down the whole time, right?
Right.
But I think it helps to be able to look at different people in the eye, not the whole time, but at times during your speech, because sometimes it's like you'll get them to be able to pay attention more to the words, and it may even affect them more. I feel like you're talking to them. So eye contact's a big one. And of course you mentioned volume. It's huge. Pitch. What's the other word? Modulation. So being able to, use your high and low tone depending on what you're talking about, right? Here's one that I think is very important. Maybe you don't. I'm sure you agree, but maybe you don't think it's the most important thing. But I think it's pretty high up on my list. Is a really good introduction.
Yep, I could agree with that.
And the reason why I say that is because, to me, that's when you get someone's attention, to be able to listen to the rest of your speech, right? If you ask a good question, you even use a really captivating experience or an illustration, that can be huge,
Absolutely.
That can be really good. So that's something that I always try to harp on with myself is, you got to get something really good at the beginning. I personally really enjoy like an illustration, like, say you're doing they're putting someone in a situation where they're imagining themselves. I feel like, me personally, that always helps me whenever I hear a speech that uses one. It helps me to be a better understand, what's being talked about. So that's 3. So obviously the volume, eye contact, modulation. I was going to say gestures, but that goes into body language, right? Altogether, body language is huge.
Yes.
As you mentioned, it's gigantic. And I learned that was always my weakness growing up, right? Because a lot of people can be good speakers vocally, but they'll do like nervous tics, right?
Yep.
So a big one is that I had to learn how to stop doing was swaying.
Yep.
Right? Or people will put their hands in their pockets.
Yep.
Right? Or they'll fiddle with their fingers, one that I struggled with for the longest time was doing my gestures too low because I wasn't fully comfortable. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So like,
no,
say
I get you.
You're at a podium and you're trying to do gestures, right? But nobody can see them because they're too low.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. That's a big one.
So yeah, body language and gestures definitely goes into that, and of course, standing up straight instead of hunching over and stuff like that. Right?
Right.
um, and then I'll throw in a fifth one here. It could go with body language, but I'm gonna separate it.
Okay.
So like facial expressions.
Okay.
The ability to smile. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about something serious, you don't necessarily want to smile, but being able to be comfortable enough to smile when it's necessary. And you kind of have to have confidence to do that, Does that make sense? Does what I say make sense?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you.
Yeah, facial expression is huge to me because, I mean, obviously, I think if you have passion, that'll kind of help you naturally show facial expressions. But I've seen people that with if it's a bad speech, it's usually includes bad facial expressions too. You know what I mean?
Well, usually if it's not written well, if somebody's not super confident in it, then that will show very quickly on their face.
Yeah. And that goes back to my experience when I would wing it, when I would kind of improvise. And sometimes that's a really good skill to have, is improvisation, and that's what acting has helped me to do sometimes with speeches, because I'm sure you'll agree, Brendan, there are times maybe you have, I don't know if you use an outline or how you do your speeches. Everyone does them differently. Maybe you have bullet points and stuff, but sometimes you'll lose your spot, or your train of thought, and you kind of just got to know what you're talking about and be passionate about it. And you can kind of just get back on track rather quickly if you can improvise well enough. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, and I'm a big I don't like using I don't use scripts at all. Like if I use like word for word, it's gonna completely throw me off. And that's like the biggest thing I tell people was like, do not write out your speech. That is the worst thing you can do for yourself. Like there are some people who could thrive off of that, but like you said, if you get lost, what are you gonna do now? I use kind of like the bullet point system, like you were talking about, but I only write down things that I know I have a chance of forgetting. So like numbers, dates, names, stuff that's important for like, the facts of the speech. Everything else, I either already have kind of, I have a general outline memorized, and then I just kind of flow off of the outline and kind of fill the pieces in with my ad-libbing, or I have usually I have an outline kind of designed in a way that I know the general topics and like kind of the evidence I want to bring up, and then I just kind of piece it together as I go.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I use a lot of like highlighting and I'll use like bold. Does that like I'll bold out the letters, or I'll italicize or underline if they're important for emphasis, stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I really like doing that, adding different colors so that my eyes can kind of catch where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah, I could definitely. I mean, I know people who do that too. That's definitely a useful strategy as well.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, that was fun.
Yeah. No, I think that we've kind of covered all the bases. I mean, like I said, there wasn't a ton to my theory, but I had some thoughts I wanted to kind of get out there and see if they're worth anything. See what you thought about them.
Yeah, interesting. You definitely brought some new perspectives onto me, something that I can think about, and things that I definitely would agree with that I didn't think about before. So it's just very eye-opening, and I hope a lot of people that are listening to this, whether you're a public speaker or it's not your forte, you're not something that you're good at, I always tell people try it once, try taking a class, try doing a little short speech. I don't know, they have classes, where you can, summer classes too. I've seen them. Take a class here with Brendan. He'll only charge you 1 or 2 paychecks, and
I think only the firstborn side.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I think it's worth a shot, because I think it can help make a difference for a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always advocate for 2 main things for people to know is for one, obviously agriculture is a big thing, know where your food comes from. But for two, public speaking, knowing how to generally interact with people, how to network, job interview skills, like all of that kind of stuff comes from a comfortability with speaking in front of others. And I think that any level of confidence you can develop in that skill is useful in the long run for any career you decide to go into.
Yeah, one of my public speaking classes, that was our last project, was job interviews. It
Oh yeah.
it's huge. I mean, if you can do really well in public speaking, my two things when it comes to a job interview, obviously, if you're good at public speaking, that'll help you out a ton, and always be honest, because
Mm-hmm.
people can tell when
Oh
you're
yeah,
making stuff
lying.
up. Yeah.
Yeah, lying comes out very quickly, especially on your face.
Yep. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, yeah, that is some great advice, and I think that kind of touches all the bases of what I was thinking. So that definitely helps me feel like I'm a little bit less insane. But yeah, I think that was a lot of fun. So why don't you go ahead and remind everybody where they can find you, Brayden, and what you're all about.
You can find me at home on my computer always. No, I'm kidding. 'Cause I'm an urban nerd. No, we have a podcast, myself and my buddy Logan, Absolutely Gobsmacked. We actually haven't released an episode in a month or two.
Mm.
We took a little bit of a break, but we're definitely about to release a couple of really huge episodes. They're big undertakings for me, and so I'll give you one of them. The next one we decided to do was we're gonna do a bonus episode. It's gonna be top 5, in our opinion, top 5 most quotable movies.
Oh
of all
man,
time. So.
that is definitely an ambitious project.
Yeah, that one, and then an even bigger one is episode number 25 for us. It's going to be the big 25. And it might have to be a two-parter. We'll see, but we're going to go into the movie Rebel Without a Cause, and interestingly enough, the 3 main characters in that movie all died tragically at different points in their life. It's really interesting and really weird. So
Interesting.
we're going to delve into that and go into each one deeply. So,
Wow. All right.
and all the conspiracies behind that and theories and everything. So, yeah.
Huh. Yeah, that'll be a lot of fun.
So, yeah,
All right.
Absolutely Gobsmacked. Find us wherever you listen to your podcast.
All right, yeah, and I'll be throwing all the links down in the description. And anyone who's followed the podcast, you guys have heard them before over on the Martian episode, same guys. So yeah, go ahead and check them out. They are definitely a lot of fun to listen to. I've listened to quite a few of theirs, and they're always a pleasure. Especially if you like movies, you're gonna love it because you hear all the behind the scenes stuff and the drama and the the secrets and all that kind of fun stuff. So it's a good time. So thanks again, Brayden, for joining me for this. It's definitely been a lot of fun.
It's
And,
an honor to be on the show. Thank you for having me.
You're always welcome back, as you constantly remind me.
Yes.
But, but yeah, so thanks again, and thanks to all my listeners for tuning in. I hope all of you enjoyed. Hope to catch you next week. And don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.